Hidden within the quiet halls of medieval monasteries, a revolution was brewing, one that would shape the very fabric of modern technology. Picture this: robed monks, their voices rising in unison, chanting sacred hymns that echoed through stone corridors. But what if I told you these ancient melodies held a secret? Beneath their spiritual surface lay the seeds of something extraordinary, the birth of algorithmic thinking. This isn't just a story about music or religion. It's about how the human mind discovered patterns so profound they would one day power the digital world we live in. Centuries before computers existed, these monks were unwitting pioneers, using notation systems that transformed sound into symbols, a language of precision that mirrored mathematical logic. Their Gregorian chants weren't just prayers, they were puzzles, carefully structured to follow rules as rigorous as any equation. Each note, each pause, each repetition was a step toward something revolutionary. And here's the twist: the tools they created to preserve their sacred music became the blueprint for processes we now call algorithms. Think about that for a moment. The same principles that guide your smartphone's search engine or your favorite streaming playlist can trace their roots back to these humble scribes and their devotion to harmony. So how did melodies become math? How did chanting monks accidentally invent a concept that would define the future? That's the journey we're about to take together. We'll unravel how medieval notation systems, those intricate marks on parchment, were more than just musical instructions. They were the first coded instructions, a way to break down complex tasks into repeatable steps. And by the time we're done, you'll never hear a simple hymn the same way again, because this story isn't just about the past, it's about the invisible threads connecting their world to ours. Ready to discover how the echoes of those ancient chants still resonate in every line of code today? Let's begin. To understand how music became math, we have to step back in time, way back to the early Christian church, where the air hummed with a single, unbroken melody. Gregorian chant wasn't just music, it was a spiritual lifeline, a way to elevate prayer beyond mere words. Picture hundreds of voices moving as one, no instruments, no harmonies, just pure, soaring melody. But here's the catch: for centuries, these chants existed only in memory, passed from teacher to student like a sacred secret. That oral tradition worked until it didn't. As Christianity spread across Europe, so did the chants, morphing with every region, every monastery, like a game of telephone across generations. The church faced a dilemma. How could they preserve the purity of these sacred songs when no two places sang them quite the same way? Enter the monks, the unsung heroes of this story. Their solution: to turn sound into sight. They began etching tiny marks above the lyrics, simple squiggles called neumes, the earliest form of musical notation. At first, these symbols were more like reminders, vague hints about whether the melody rose or fell. But over time, they evolved into something far more precise. Imagine the leap here. For the first time in history, music wasn't just something you heard, it was something you could see. A melody could now be frozen on parchment, shared across continents, and sung the same way in Rome as it was in Paris. This wasn't just about preserving beauty, it was about control, consistency, and something deeper: the power of abstraction. Those squiggles on the page were more than notes, they were instructions, a set of rules to follow. And rules, as any programmer will tell you, are the heart of algorithms. The monks didn't realize it, but they'd stumbled onto a groundbreaking idea: breaking down a complex process like a chant into discrete, repeatable steps. Every neume was a line of code telling the singer, Here go up, here hold, here descend. Sound familiar, it should. Today we call that logic. What's astonishing is how deliberate this system became. By the 11th century, a monk named Guido of Arezo refined notation further, adding lines to the page, literally drawing the staff we still use today. Now, pitches had exact positions like coordinates on a map. A melody wasn't just a suggestion, it was a blueprint, and that's the magic moment, when music stopped being an art of imitation and became an art of precision. The church got its uniformity, but the world got something far bigger, a way to translate the fluidity of human creativity into the rigidity of symbols. Little did those monks know, they weren't just writing music, they were writing the future. Imagine holding an entire library of melodies in your mind, not just tunes, but sacred texts set to music, each with intricate rises and falls, pauses and flourishes. That was the reality for medieval monks tasked with preserving Gregorian chant. Without written notation, these melodies lived only in memory, passed down like fragile heirlooms from one generation to the next. But human memory is a fickle thing. A single skipped note, a momentary lapse, and suddenly a chant that had been sung the same way for decades could shift, morph, or even vanish entirely. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just about music, it was about faith. The church believed these chants were divinely inspired, a direct link to the sacred. Yet as Christianity spread across Europe, so did the variations. A melody sung in a French monastery might drift subtly from its original form by the time it reached Germany. Regional accents crept in, local preferences colored the phrasing, and over centuries the chants risked becoming unrecognizable. It was like a game of telephone played across generations, except the message wasn't just gossip, it was the word of God. The monks faced a dilemma. How do you preserve something as fluid as music in a world without recordings, without even a way to write it down? Oral tradition had its limits. A master might teach his students, but what happened when that master was gone? The solution had to be more permanent, more precise. And so, almost out of necessity, they began to experiment, etching tiny marks above the sacred texts, little reminders of how the melody moved. These early neumes were crude, more like road signs than sheet music, but they represented something revolutionary, the first step toward turning sound into symbol. What's fascinating is how this struggle mirrors modern challenges. Think of software developers today, writing code that must run perfectly every time, on any device, anywhere in the world. The monks were grappling with the same core problem: how to create a system so precise, so universal, that it could transmit complex information flawlessly across time and space. Their answer, written notation, didn't just preserve music, it transformed it into something reproducible, analyzable, even predictable. In other words, it turned art into a kind of science. By the time Guido of Arezo refined the staff in the 11th century, the implications were staggering. Suddenly, a melody wasn't just a fleeting moment of beauty. It was a fixed sequence, a set of instructions that could be followed exactly, whether in a chapel in Rome or a cathedral in England. The monks had done more than solve a practical problem. They'd unlocked a new way of thinking, one where creativity and precision weren't opposites, but partners. And in that partnership lay the seeds of something even they couldn't foresee, the very logic that would one day power our digital age. Those first neumes were more like whispers on parchment than a full-fledged language of music. Imagine a scribe hunched over a sacred text, adding tiny arcs and dots above the words, not to dictate exact pitches, but to jog the memory of singers who already knew the melody. A rising squiggle might suggest lifting the voice, while a descending dash hinted at a fall. But here's the catch: without lines or precise spacing, these symbols were open to interpretation. A neume that meant one thing in Cluny might signal something subtly different in Cologne. Yet within this ambiguity lay something revolutionary. For the first time, sound wasn't just ephemeral, it was captured, however imperfectly. Think of it like the earliest cave paintings, crude at first, but undeniably the birth of a new way to communicate. Over time, monks began refining these symbols, adding clarity through context. A cluster of neumes might appear closer together to suggest quicker notes, or spaced apart to imply a drawn-out phrase. It was a system learning to speak, one adjustment at a time. The real breakthrough came when monks realized neumes could do more than remind, they could instruct. By the 10th century, scribes started grouping symbols into patterns that mirrored the natural flow of the chant. An upward leap followed by smaller steps might echo the contour of a prayer's emotional arc. This wasn't just notation anymore, it was analysis. The monks were dissecting music, breaking it into components like a mathematician isolating variables. And in that dissection, they stumbled onto a profound truth. Melody, at its core, was a series of relationships. The interval between notes, the duration of a pause, these weren't just artistic choices. They were measurable quantities. What made this evolution so pivotal wasn't just the precision it added to music. It was the mindset it demanded. To read neumes was to accept that sound followed rules, that beauty could be systematized. And once that door opened, there was no turning back. The squiggles that began as humble memory aids became the foundation for something far grander, a language that could translate the ineffable into the concrete. Little did those scribes know, they weren't just preserving hymns, they were laying the groundwork for a world where even the most human of arts could be reduced or elevated to a series of elegant, solvable equations. Guido of Arezo wasn't just a monk, he was a problem solver. In the early 11th century, while most of Europe was still relying on those vague neumes to guide their chants, Guido saw a flaw in the system. What good were symbols if they couldn't guarantee consistency? Imagine trying to build a house with blueprints that only said, "Make this wall sort of tall." That was the reality of music notation before Guido stepped in. His solution, a simple but revolutionary tool, the staff. Picture a blank parchment with 4 horizontal lines scratched across it. At first glance, it might not look like much, but those lines became the foundation of musical precision. Here's how it worked. Each line and the spaces between them represented a specific pitch, like rungs on a ladder. A note placed on the bottom line meant one pitch. A note in the space above it meant another, higher one. Suddenly, melodies weren't just suggestions, they were mapped out with the clarity of a mathematical equation. Guido had done something extraordinary. He'd turned sound into geometry. But the real genius of the staff wasn't just its visual clarity. It introduced the idea of discreteness, the notion that music could be broken down into exact, repeatable steps. Think of it like counting stairs instead of sliding down a ramp. Each note on the staff was a separate, measurable unit, just like the ones and zeros in modern computing. Guido didn't know it, but he'd stumbled onto a principle that would define algorithms centuries later: the power of breaking complexity into clear, individual instructions. What's even more fascinating is how Guido arrived at this system. Legend has it he used an ancient hymn to Saint John at Quint Laxus as a teaching tool. The hymn's melody happened to rise by one precise interval with each new phrase, creating a natural scale. Guido took those syllables ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, and turned them into the very first solfege, the ancestor of today's do, re, mi. This wasn't just a clever mnemonic, it was evidence that music followed predictable, almost mathematical patterns. The impact was immediate. For the first time, a choir in one monastery could sing a chant exactly as it was written in another, hundreds of miles away. But the ripple effects went far beyond the church. Guido's staff laid the groundwork for everything from symphonies to software. After all, what's an algorithm if not a set of instructions placed in a specific order, each step as deliberate as a note on a staff? The monks of the Middle Ages may have been seeking harmony in worship, but in doing so, they gave the world a new way to think, one line, one space, one precise step at a time. Guido of Arezo's psalmization system didn't just teach monks to sing, it rewired the way humans understood sound. Picture a young choir member in the 11th century, staring at a parchment covered in unfamiliar neumes. Without the ability to read music, how could they possibly reproduce a melody they'd never heard? Guido's answer was as simple as it was brilliant: syllables. By assigning the 6-note scale the sounds ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, he transformed abstract pitches into something tangible, something singable. This wasn't just a naming convention, it was a cognitive shortcut, a way to internalize the relationships between notes. The magic lay in the hymn Ut Quint Laxus, a melody where each phrase began one step higher than the last. Guido noticed this predictable ascent and used it as a scaffold, attaching syllables to each new pitch. Suddenly, singers didn't need perfect pitch or endless repetition. They had a mental map. Ut was always the starting point, fa the midway anchor, and the intervals between them followed strict, repeatable patterns. It was like learning the alphabet but for sound. And just like letters forming words, these syllables could be rearranged, combined, and memorized to unlock any melody. But here's what made psalmization revolutionary. It wasn't passive memorization, it was active processing. A monk chanting Ut Re Mi wasn't just recalling notes, they were executing a sequence, a step-by-step procedure to navigate the scale. In modern terms, Guido had created a primitive algorithm, a set of instructions to decode music's underlying structure. Think of it like a recipe. Follow the syllables in order, and you'd reliably produce the correct intervals. Stray from the sequence, and the result would falter. This was music as a system, a series of logical operations rather than mere intuition. The parallels to computing are uncanny. Just as programming languages break complex tasks into discrete commands, psalmization broke melodies into manageable syllables. Each one functioned like a variable, representing not just a note but its position within a larger framework. Fa, for instance, was more than a pitch. It was a pivot point, a tonal center that anchored the entire scale. Singers learned to recognize its gravitational pull, adjusting other notes around it. This wasn't far removed from how algorithms handle inputs and outputs, with certain values triggering specific actions. What's striking is how enduring this system proved. Centuries later, Ut became Du, and the scale expanded, but the core principle remained: syllables as cognitive tools. Even today, music students use solfege to train their ears and voices, proving Guido's method wasn't just a medieval hack. It was a fundamental insight into how the brain processes patterns. And that's the real lesson here. The monks weren't just preserving hymns, they were pioneering a way to think about information. By turning sound into symbols and symbols into systems, they laid the groundwork for a world where even the most fluid art forms could be analyzed, replicated, and ultimately automated. The rhythm of monastic life wasn't just about devotion, it was a masterclass in structured thinking. Every day, from before dawn until long after dusk, monks moved through a meticulously choreographed dance of prayer, labor, and study. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, didn't just suggest this routine, it codified it down to the minute. Lauds at daybreak, prime at sunrise, terce mid-morning, each hour marked by the ringing of bells and the turn of tasks. This wasn't mere habit, it was a living algorithm, a repeating loop of input and output that shaped not just their days but their very cognition. Consider the parallels. Just as an algorithm breaks a complex problem into discrete steps, the monastic schedule decomposed time into manageable units, each with a clear purpose. Matins required chanting specific psalms in a set order, just like a function in code executes commands sequentially. The kitchen crew prepared meals following strict recipes timed to coincide with breaks between prayers variables aligned to produce a predictable outcome. Even their manual labor, whether copying manuscripts or tending crops, adhered to seasonal cycles that repeated like clockwork. Year after year, the same rhythms, the same sequences, training the mind to see the world not as chaos, but as a series of solvable patterns. What's revelatory is how this discipline bled into their intellectual work. Scribes copying ancient texts didn't just transcribe. They followed painstaking protocols preparing parchment, mixing ink, proofreading, each step as methodical as a modern debugger checking lines of code. The scriptorium wasn't just a workshop, it was a precursor to the assembly line where knowledge was processed, standardized, and replicated with near mechanical precision. And when these monks turned to music, that same mindset applied. Composing a chant wasn't left to inspiration alone. It was built note by note, interval by interval, following rules as unbending as the bells that governed their sleep. The genius of this system lay in its feedback loops. Deviations, a skipped prayer, a botched transcription were immediately apparent, just like errors in a program's output. Corrections weren't punitive, they were instructive, reinforcing the idea that precision led to harmony. Over generations, this cultivated a unique cognitive toolkit, the ability to see processes as modular, to trust in incremental progress, and to believe that even the most sacred mysteries could be approached systematically. We often think of algorithms as cold, mechanical things, but the monks remind us they spring from something deeply human, the desire to find order in the noise. When they sang their psalms in rounds or plotted the liturgical calendar's intricate dependencies, they weren't just keeping time. They were proving that structure could be sacred, that rhythm itself might be a form of revelation. Little did they know, their daily obedience to the bell would echo centuries later in the ticking logic of every machine that follows instructions, one deliberate step at a time. The leap from sacred chant to mathematical logic wasn't a sudden revelation. It was a slow, inevitable unfolding. As monks refined their notation, they weren't just preserving melodies, they were unwittingly building a bridge between art and algebra. Take those early neumes. What began as vague squiggles evolved into precise markers of pitch and duration, each symbol carrying measurable meaning. A note on the fourth line of Guido's staff wasn't just higher than one on the third. It represented a specific interval, a calculable distance. Music, once fluid and interpretive, was becoming a grid of fixed relationships, a world where every sound had coordinates. This shift demanded a new kind of literacy. To read notation wasn't just to recognize symbols, it was to perform mental calculations. A singer scanning a chant had to instantly translate spatial position into pitch, duration into rhythm, like solving a series of tiny equations. The page became a ledger of values. A breve was twice as long as a semibreve. A perfect fifth spanned 3 lines and a space. Even the modal system, the scales governing medieval music, functioned like mathematical sets with rules about which notes could follow others. Compose outside those rules, and the result would clash like an incorrect sum. What's striking is how these musical structures mirrored the era's growing fascination with number theory. The same monasteries preserving chants were also copying Euclid's Elements, studying Bothius's arithmetic, and pondering the harmony of the spheres, the ancient belief that celestial bodies moved to mathematical ratios. Music wasn't an exception to this worldview, it was proof. When monks arranged notes in symmetrical patterns or built canons where melodies echoed at strict intervals, they weren't just creating beauty. They were demonstrating that sound, like the cosmos, obeyed quantifiable laws. The true genius of their system lay in its scalability. Just as a single algorithm can process infinite inputs, musical notation could encode anything from a simple hymn to a complex polyphonic mass. The rules stayed constant, but the outputs multiplied. This universality made notation eerily similar to a programming language. Symbols acted as commands: hold this note, leap this interval. Sequences formed loops, repeated psalm tones, and even errors had consequences: avoid the devil's interval, a dissonant tritone believed to summon evil. The monks had created a syntax for sound one so robust, it could transmit compositions across centuries without a single recording. Consider the implications. A modern programmer writes code in symbols that a machine interprets. A medieval scribe wrote neumes that a singer's brain computed. Both rely on abstraction, on reducing fluid reality to discrete instructions. The difference: monks weren't building software, they were encoding human experience into a format that could survive time. Those parchment pages didn't just preserve melodies, they proved that even something as ephemeral as song could be captured, dissected, and reconstructed. In doing so, they handed the future a radical idea. If music could be rendered as math, what else might? Bothius sat in a prison cell, awaiting execution, when he penned words that would echo through the ages. This 6th century Roman scholar, condemned by a king he once served, wasn't just writing a philosophical consolation. He was quietly preserving the intellectual foundation of the medieval world. Among his final works was De Institution Musica, a treatise that would become the bridge between ancient Greek wisdom and the monastic scholars of the Middle Ages. Imagine the weight of that moment, a man facing death, meticulously translating complex musical theories into Latin, ensuring they wouldn't vanish with the fall of Rome. His genius lay in synthesis. Bothius didn't just copy Greek ideas, he reframed them, distilling the musical theories of Pythagoras, Plato, and Nicomachus into a system medieval monks could grasp. At its heart was a radical proposition. Music wasn't merely art or entertainment, it was a branch of mathematics as rigorous as geometry. Picture Pythagoras' legendary discovery, plucking strings at precise ratios to produce harmonious intervals. The octave was a 2-to-1 ratio, the perfect fifth 3-to-2. These weren't aesthetic preferences, they were cosmic laws, proof that beauty followed calculable patterns. Bothius took these insights and made them portable, wrapping them in the language of quadrivium, the 4 mathematical arts that formed the core of medieval education. For monastic scholars, this was revelatory. Suddenly, chanting wasn't just spiritual practice, it was applied mathematics. When monks sang a perfect fifth, they weren't just harmonizing, they were embodying the same ratios Pythagoras found in vibrating strings. Boethius gave them a framework to see music as a microcosm of universal order, where celestial harmony mirrored earthly sound. His influence seeped into every aspect of medieval musical thought. Guido of Arezo's staff, it relied on Boethius's intervals, the church's modal system rooted in his classifications. Even the layout of pipe organs reflected his mathematical principles, with pipe lengths calculated to match harmonic proportions. But Boethius's impact went deeper than notation or instruments. He taught the medieval mind to listen numerically. A monk tracing the rise and fall of a chant wasn't just following melody, he was tracking a series of mathematical relationships, each interval a fraction made audible. This mindset that the sensory world could be decoded through number would eventually fuel breakthroughs far beyond music. The same analytical approach that dissected scales would later unravel planetary motion, architectural acoustics, even the workings of the human ear. What's haunting is how Bothius foresaw this legacy. In his final writings, he described music as the force that unites the rational soul with the body, a metaphor for harmony on every scale from the human to the cosmic. Centuries later, his prison cell translations would inspire thinkers from Charlemagne's court to the dawn of the Renaissance, proving that even in chains, ideas could resonate louder than empires. The monks who pored over his manuscripts may have sought divine harmony, but they inherited something equally profound: the tools to turn wonder into logic, and in doing so, plant the seeds of the algorithmic age. Imagine walking into a medieval classroom where the walls hum with the quiet intensity of deep thought. Here, arithmetic and astronomy share the same table with geometry and, surprisingly, music. This was the quadrivium, the fourfold path of advanced learning that treated these disciplines not as separate subjects, but as branches of the same mathematical tree. To modern ears, pairing music with geometry might sound strange, but for medieval scholars, the connection was obvious. Music wasn't about self-expression or entertainment. It was about uncovering the numerical secrets hidden in every chord and cadence. At the heart of this system lay a simple but profound idea. Harmony is math made audible. Take the octave, that most fundamental of musical intervals. When a monk sang a note and then its octave, he wasn't just creating a pleasing sound, he was embodying the ratio 2:1, the same proportion that governed the lengths of vibrating strings or the orbits of planets. The perfect fifth, 3:2, the fourth, 4:3, these weren't artistic choices, they were cosmic constants, as predictable as the angles of a triangle. Quadrivium didn't just place music alongside math, it revealed music as math, a living demonstration of how abstract numbers shaped the sensory world. This framework transformed how monks approached composition. A chant wasn't crafted solely for beauty. It was constructed like a geometric proof, with each interval chosen to align with sacred ratios. The modes scales that preceded modern major and minor were carefully tuned to avoid the dissonant tritone, an interval so jarring it earned the nickname Diabolus in musica, the devil in music. Why? Because it violated the clean mathematical relationships that defined proper harmony. To modern ears, this might sound restrictive, but for medieval thinkers, these rules weren't limits. They were glimpses into the mind of a creator who built the universe with numbers. The quadrivium's influence extended far beyond the choir. Monks studying astronomy noticed planetary motions followed harmonic proportions, mirroring the intervals of their chants. Architects designing cathedrals used the same ratios to determine vault heights and window placements, creating spaces where sound and structure resonated in mathematical unison. Even the rhythmic patterns of poetry borrowed from musical meter, turning syllables into countable units. Everywhere they looked, the monks found confirmation. The world wasn't just orderly, it was musical, a grand composition waiting to be decoded. What made this world view so pivotal was its emphasis on pattern recognition. The quadrivium trained minds to look beyond surface chaos and find the underlying algorithms, the repeatable rules governing everything from star paths to hymn structures. When Guido of Arezo devised his staff or Bothius passed Greek music theory, they weren't just preserving knowledge, they were participating in a centuries-long project to map the invisible scaffolding of reality. And in that project lay the seeds of something revolutionary. The same skills that let a monk calculate the perfect fifth would one day allow scientists to compute planetary orbits, engineers to design resonant bridges, and programmers to write loops that repeat with clockwork precision. The quadrivium's legacy isn't just in what it taught, but how it taught by insisting that music, like math, was a language of relationships. To study one was to master the other. Those medieval classrooms where chants were dissected like equations and ratios were sung aloud were incubators for a mindset that would eventually give us computers, cryptography, and the very concept of code. The monks may have been seeking divine harmony, but in the process they handed humanity a new way to think, not in notes or numbers alone, but in the hidden symmetries that bind them together. The word algorithm might sound like modern tech jargon, but its roots stretch back over 1,000 years to the bustling intellectual hubs of the Islamic Golden Age. In the 9th century, a Persian mathematician named Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi penned groundbreaking works that would forever link his name to the concept of systematic problem solving. His treatise on the calculation with Hindu numerals introduced Europe to Indian numerals, yes, the very digits we use today, along with step-by-step methods for arithmetic and algebra. Latin translators stumbled over his name, rendering it as algorithmi, and over time, the term algorithm came to signify any set of rules for calculations. But here's the twist. While the monks of medieval Europe never heard the word algorithm, their work with musical notation was already living its definition. Think about it, an algorithm at its core is just a sequence of instructions to achieve a desired outcome, whether it's solving an equation or, say, singing a Gregorian chant correctly. When Guido of Arezo's staff told a singer to place a note on the 3rd line, hold it for 2 beats, then descend to the space below, that wasn't just musical notation. It was a proto-algorithm, a coded recipe for reproducing sound. The parallels run deeper. Al-Khwarizmi's methods were prized for their repeatability. Input the same numbers, follow the steps, and you'd always get the same result. The monk's notation aimed for identical precision. A melody scribed on parchment in one monastery had to sound identical when sung in another, miles away. Both systems relied on abstraction, turning tangible realities, numbers, sounds into symbols, digits, neumes that could be manipulated predictably. The difference: Al-Khwarizmi was crunching equations while the monks were encoding devotion. What's fascinating is how these two threads, mathematical and musical, eventually intertwined. By the late Middle Ages, scholars began applying algebraic thinking to music theory, calculating intervals like harmonic ratios or tuning systems with the same rigor as quadratic equations. The silent algorithms of chant notation had quietly prepared the West for a broader revolution. The idea that even art could be reduced to logic. Centuries later, when Ada Lovelace wrote the first computer program in the 1840s, she chose a surprising subject to demonstrate its potential: music. The very thing those monks had systematized became the proving ground for a new era of computation. So while the term algorithm postdates the medieval period by centuries, its spirit was alive in every monastery scriptorium where neumes met parchment. The monks may not have called their work by that name, but in breaking down the fluidity of song into fixed, repeatable steps, they were practicing something profoundly similar. After all, what's an algorithm if not a way to make the intangible tangible, the fleeting permanent? Whether scribbled in Persian ink or inked onto Gregorian chant books, the goal was the same: to harness order from chaos, one deliberate instruction at a time. Listen closely to a Gregorian chant, and you'll notice something peculiar: the way certain phrases circle back on themselves, like a musical echo. This wasn't just artistic flair, it was a structural necessity. Many chants followed patterns where verses repeated with slight variations, or where the chorus returned after each new line, creating a rhythmic pulse beneath the sacred text. What sounds like a simple devotional technique to modern ears was actually something far more sophisticated, an early form of looping. Think about how a programmer writes a for loop, a set of instructions that repeat until a condition is met. A medieval hymn like the Kyrie eleison functioned similarly. The phrase Kyrie eleison, Christ eleison wasn't sung just once. It cycled in predictable sequences, adapting slightly each time to fit the prayer's progression. The monks didn't have terms like iteration or recursion, but they understood the power of repetition with variation. Each recurrence wasn't redundant, it was incremental, building emotional and spiritual intensity through disciplined recurrence. This mirrored the very structure of their daily lives. The divine office, the cycle of prayers marking each hour, was itself a kind of living algorithm. Matins at dawn, lauds at sunrise, vespers at dusk, the same rituals unfolding in loops, yet never quite the same because the context shifted with the season, the scripture, even the weather. The monks didn't just perform these cycles, they internalized them, training their minds to think in nested patterns. A psalm verse might repeat within a hymn, which itself repeated within the weekly liturgy, which cycled annually with the church calendar. Layers of repetition, each with purpose. What's striking is how these musical loops anticipated modern computational logic. Take the concept of recursion, a function that calls itself. In chant, this appeared in compositions like the Sanctus, where melodic motifs echoed at different scales, phrases nested within phrases like musical fractals. Even the notation system reinforced this mindset. A single neume could represent a group of notes, a modular unit to be reused across compositions, not unlike a programmer's function defined once and called repeatedly. The brilliance lay in how these loops balanced rigidity and flexibility. Just as a well-designed algorithm handles edge cases without breaking, liturgical music had rules for when to abbreviate a chant if time was short or extend it for feast days. The structure wasn't brittle, it was adaptive, capable of scaling from intimate chapels to grand cathedrals without losing coherence. Today, we take loops for granted. Our playlists cycle endlessly, our apps refresh automatically. But the monks remind us that repetition isn't just mechanical, it's transformative. Their chants weren't stuck in a loop, they were using loops to ascend, each iteration a step closer to something transcendent. In that sacred repetition, they stumbled onto a truth that would later power the digital age. Sometimes the path to complexity begins with knowing exactly when to repeat yourself. Hidden away in a Spanish monastery, a small wooden figure kneels in perpetual devotion, its head bowing, its arm crossing its chest, its eyes rolling heavenward. But this is no ordinary monk. Crafted in the 16th century, this automaton moves with eerie precision, powered by an intricate system of gears and weights. To the faithful, it was a marvel of sacred engineering. To modern eyes, it's something more, a glimpse into the medieval mind's daring leap toward mechanizing the human. These clockwork monks weren't mere curiosities, they were experiments in replication, built by master craftsmen, often under the patronage of wealthy clergy. They mimicked the most intimate of human actions: prayer, writing, even playing musical instruments. Take the famous writing automaton attributed to mathematician Johannes Müller von Königsberg, a metal figure that could dip its quill, shake off excess ink, and produce perfectly formed letters on parchment. The technology was crude by today's standards, but the ambition was staggering. For the first time, humans had created machines that didn't just assist labor, they performed it, executing sequences as deliberately as a monk chanting psalms. What made these devices truly revolutionary wasn't their mechanics, but their logic beneath the brass, and would lay a precursor to programmable thought. The automaton's movements weren't random. They followed fixed pathways dictated by Cam's lobed wheels that converted rotational motion into precise actions. A bump on the cam might trigger the monk's arm to rise, while a dip could make it lower. This was binary thinking made physical, on or off, lift or drop, all governed by the machine's immutable design. In essence, these cams were the earliest stored programs, hardwired instructions that played out again and again with flawless consistency. The implications rippled far beyond the chapel. When medieval engineers designed automata that could play flute melodies by reading pinned barrels, a technology later adapted for music boxes, they were inventing the first read-only memory. Each pin was a bit of data, telling the instrument when to sound a note and when to stay silent. The same principle would later drive Jacquard's loom, player pianos, and eventually punch card computers. But in the 16th century, this idea was radical, that a machine could follow encoded instructions to produce complex, repeatable outcomes without human intervention. Perhaps the most poignant detail lies in the clockwork monk's original purpose. These devices weren't built to replace prayer, but to amplify it, to keep devotion unceasing even when human hands grew weary. Yet in striving to mechanize the sacred, their creators accidentally revealed something profound about all ritual, all repetition, that beneath the surface of even our most spiritual acts lies a framework as precise as any algorithm. The monks who chanted in loops and the craftsmen who built praying machines were, in their own ways, grappling with the same question. How much of what we call human can be distilled into rules, rhythms, and gears? Centuries later, as we tap commands into devices that execute tasks with inhuman speed, we're still living their answer. The clockwork monk may have been a devotional toy, but in its jerky motions, we see the birth of a world where even the ineffable could be broken down and built back up into steps. Beneath the soaring arches of medieval monasteries, where chants filled the air like sacred smoke, some scholars suspect the music held more than met the ear. Hidden within the rise and fall of Gregorian melodies, layered between the notes themselves, may have been secrets, coded messages meant only for those who knew how to listen. Take the Elham Ame tradition, where composers for centuries embedded the same popular tune into their masses. On the surface, it was a musical homage, but some argue it was also a cipher, a way to signal allegiance or even smuggle subversive ideas under the guise of worship. The theory gains traction when you examine how meticulously these chants were constructed. Certain melodies followed numerical patterns aligning with biblical symbolism, 3-note motifs echoing the Trinity, 7-phrase structures mirroring creation, or 12-note sequences representing apostles. In the Sarum chant used in English cathedrals, specific intervals recur at precise points, almost like musical punctuation marking hidden divisions in the text. Were these just artistic choices or deliberate encodings? Even more intriguing are the pneumatic codes, where clusters of neumes might form shapes resembling letters or symbols when viewed on parchment. A rising group of 3 notes could subtly trace the Greek alpha, while a descending line intersected with a squiggle might hint at a cross. To the untrained eye, it was mere notation. To initiates, perhaps a parallel language. Some researchers point to the Rosslyn Chapel carvings in Scotland, where stone angels hold musical staves that, when deciphered, allegedly reveal a hidden harmonic message, though skeptics dismiss this as coincidence. Whether these patterns were intentional or imagined, their persistence reveals something profound. Medieval minds didn't just see music as art, they treated it as a vessel, a medium capable of carrying layered meanings. The same discipline that turned chants into mathematical sequences could just as easily twist them into ciphers. After all, if a melody could encode the divine proportions of the universe, why not a secret doctrine or a veiled prophecy? What's undeniable is how this blurring of music and cryptography foreshadowed later innovations. The Renaissance's musical ciphers, where notes corresponded to letters, directly borrowed from medieval techniques. Even today, the principles are alive in digital encryption, where patterns, like the frequencies of sound, can cloak information in plain sight. The monks may not have buried treasure maps in their hymns, but in treating music as a puzzle waiting to be solved, they proved that even the most sacred art could double as a language of hidden logic. For all its brilliance, medieval notation was far from perfect. It captured melody but left rhythm frustratingly vague. Those early neumes could tell a singer whether to rise or fall in pitch, but they offered no exact timing, no way to know if a note should linger like candlelight or snap quick as a closing prayer book. Imagine a recipe that lists ingredients but omits measurements. That was the challenge facing musicians trying to decode these parchments. A single squiggle might represent a quick passing tone or a sustained cry of devotion, leaving interpretation up to tradition, memory, and guesswork. This ambiguity forced choirs to rely heavily on oral coaching, with seasoned monks teaching newcomers the unwritten rules through endless repetition. The notation wasn't standalone, it was a shadow of the full performance, requiring living context to animate it. Even Guido's staff, revolutionary as it was, focused squarely on pitch. Rhythm remained trapped in an oral tradition, vulnerable to drift and variation, precisely the problem notation was meant to solve in the first place. The absence of dynamics, those subtle shifts between loud and soft, was another glaring gap. A chant might swell with emotion or whisper in reverence, but the parchment gave no hint. These expressive choices lived solely in the minds of performers, passed down like family secrets. Compare that to modern sheet music, where crescendos and diminuendos are meticulously marked, and you realize how much medieval notation left to intuition. Yet these shortcomings weren't failures, they were stepping stones. Just as early algorithms evolved through iteration, think of Babylonian multiplication tables giving way to algebraic formulas, musical notation refined itself problem by problem. By the 13th century, Franco of Cologne introduced mensural notation, adding stems and flags to indicate note durations. Suddenly, rhythm had a grammar. Notes could be imperfect 2 beats or perfect 3, echoing the Holy Trinity, turning time itself into a measurable grid. What's striking is how this evolution mirrors the development of computing logic. Early programming languages, like early notation, were clunky and incomplete, requiring users to fill gaps with workarounds. Over time, both systems grew more precise, adding layers of specificity to eliminate ambiguity. Medieval scribes didn't just want notation to record music, they wanted it to reproduce it faithfully, anywhere, anytime, a goal eerily similar to today's pursuit of platform-independent code. The takeaway: progress isn't about getting it perfect on the first try. Those gaps in medieval notation weren't oversights, they were invitations for Franco to define rhythm, for Renaissance composers to add dynamics, and ultimately, for us to see the unbroken thread between their puzzles and ours. Every time a programmer debugs a glitch or refines an algorithm, they're walking the same path those monks once did, turning ambiguity into order, one deliberate innovation at a time. Before Gutenberg's press, musical notation was a rare and precious artifact hand-copied by monks on expensive parchment, each sheet a labor of devotion. A single choir book could take months to produce, its neumes painstakingly inked by candlelight. This scarcity meant music traveled slowly, locked within the walls of wealthy churches and monasteries. But in the mid-15th century, everything changed. With the invention of movable type, notation didn't just spread. It exploded, flooding Europe with standardized sheets that turned music from a local tradition into a continental conversation. Think of it like the leap from handwritten letters to mass-produced books. Suddenly, a motet composed in Burgundy could be printed, packed, and sung in Vienna within weeks. The press didn't just replicate sheet music, it normalized it. Variations that once crept in with each scribe's quill were now fixed in metal type, creating a universal language of notes and rhythms. Composers like Josquin des Prez became household names, their works circulating like hit singles except instead of streaming algorithms. Distribution relied on horse-drawn carts and merchant ships. Parallels to today's digital age are uncanny. Just as open-source platforms let coders build on each other's work, printed music became a collaborative playground. A composer in Flanders might tweak a melody from Italy, add harmonies inspired by German choirs, and publish the hybrid as something entirely new. This was the first viral remix culture, powered not by clicks but by ink and parchment. Even the church struggled to control it. Heretical hymns could now spread as fast as orthodox ones, turning the press into both a tool of unity and a weapon of dissent. What's often overlooked is how this revolution mirrored the monk's original goal, precision at scale. Gutenberg didn't just mechanize writing, he perfected the monk's dream of error-free replication. Where a tired scribe might miscopy a neume, the press stamped the same symbol 1,000 times without variation. In a way, those medieval chant books were the beta version. Gutenberg's press was the full software update, complete with bug fixes. Yet for all its efficiency, something poetic lingered in the transition. Early printed music often left space for hand-painted initials, a nod to the artistry of the scriptorium. Even as machines took over, humans insisted on leaving their mark, a reminder that behind every innovation, whether in 15th century Mainz or a Silicon Valley garage, lies the same restless urge to share ideas faster, farther, and more faithfully than ever before. The parchment sheets of medieval monks and the glowing screens of modern programmers might seem worlds apart, but peel back the surface, and you'll find the same fundamental truth. Both are languages built on symbols that command action. When a 10th century scribe drew a neume above a syllable, that tiny mark was more than decoration. It was an instruction, a line of code telling the singer, "Here, lift your voice." Fast forward 1,000 years and a software engineer types print "Hello, world" with the same intent, symbols translating thought into executable steps. Consider the syntax rules that govern both systems. A misplaced neume in a chant could turn a sacred hymn into dissonance, just as a missing semicolon in Python crashes a program. Medieval notation had its own version of debugging, monks painstakingly checking each symbol against the original to prevent errors in transmission. Today's IDEs flag syntax mistakes in real time, but the principle remains identical: precision matters. Even the concept of modularity bridges these eras. Just as modern programmers write functions to reuse code, medieval composers recycled melodic phrases like the Christelesson across different chants, creating a library of musical snippets to mix and match. The parallels extend to abstraction layers. Guido's staff transformed sound into visual coordinates, much like how programming languages convert logic into binary. A monk reading notes on a staff didn't need to understand the physics of vibrating air. A developer writing SQL queries doesn't manipulate database bits directly. Both systems exist to simplify complexity, creating user-friendly interfaces between human intention and mechanical execution. Perhaps most strikingly, both notations share a core purpose: replication. A chant scribbled on vellum in Cluny wasn't meant to stay there. It was designed to reproduce the same sounds in any monastery that possessed the code. Similarly, a Python script runs identically whether executed in Tokyo or Toronto. This universality is what makes notation revolutionary. It decouples knowledge from individual memory, allowing ideas to scale across time and space with near-perfect fidelity. Yet there's one crucial difference. When monks wrote neumes, they were encoding human behavior, training voices and minds to follow instructions. Today's programmers write for machines that lack intuition. A misplaced neume might still yield a singable melody through a performer's improvisation, but a misplaced bracket crashes a program because silicon has no capacity to figure out what you meant. In that gap lies the monk's lasting insight. The best systems balance rigidity with flexibility, leaving room for the human spirit to breathe between the lines of code. The Fibonacci sequence feels almost magical, a series of numbers where each one is the sum of the two before it, spiraling outward in a rhythm that echoes through sunflowers, seashells, and even the human ear. But what does this 13th century mathematical marvel have to do with medieval monks and their chants? As it turns out, everything. Hidden within the very structure of music lies a kinship with Fibonacci's numbers, revealing yet another thread tying melody to mathematics. Take the construction of musical scales. The most pleasing intervals to the human ear, the octave, the fifth, the fourth, all correspond to simple ratios found early in the Fibonacci sequence. An octave vibrates at a 2-to-1 ratio, mirroring the sequence's second step. A perfect fifth resonates at 3-to-2, just like the leap from Fibonacci's second to third number. These aren't accidents, they're evidence that our brains are wired to find beauty in the same proportions that govern nature's growth patterns. Medieval composers, though they lacked the term Fibonacci, instinctively leaned into these relationships when crafting their harmonies. Rhythm, too, dances to Fibonacci's tune. Certain medieval compositions unfold in phrases that follow the sequence's pattern, 5 beats followed by 8 or 13 measures resolving a theme. Listen closely to the Dies Irae, that haunting chant about the Day of Judgment, and you'll hear phrases that build tension by expanding in Fibonacci like increments before resolving. Even the rhythmic modes, the fixed patterns of long and short notes used in early polyphony, often mirrored the sequence's cadence, creating a subliminal sense of balance that feels as inevitable as a branching tree. What's mesmerizing is how this mathematical undercurrent transcends time. Centuries after Fibonacci penned his Liber Abaci, composers like Debussy and Bartók deliberately wove the sequence into their works, using it to structure melodies and harmonies. But the monks were there first, guided not by calculation but by intuition, by ears attuned to the same natural order that Fibonacci later quantified. Their chants, though meant to elevate the soul, inadvertently traced the contours of a universal code, one that connects the spiral of a galaxy to the structure of a hymn. This intersection of math and music isn't just academic, it's visceral. When a choir sings a phrase that swells in Fibonacci proportions, something in us recognizes that rhythm, not as numbers but as rightness. The sequence doesn't just describe music, it explains why certain patterns feel inevitable, why some resolutions satisfy deep in the bones. The monks may not have named the pattern, but in their pursuit of sacred harmony, they touched something even Fibonacci would have marveled at: proof that the line between art and algorithm was never really a line at all, but a circle, endlessly recursive, humming with the same eternal ratios. Long before the term algorithm entered our vocabulary, medieval monks were already seeing the world through a lens of divine patterns that extended far beyond their choir stalls. As they walked monastery gardens or tended to herb beds, these scholar monks noticed something remarkable. Nature itself seemed to sing in structured sequences. The rhythmic calls of birds at dawn weren't random noise but repeating motifs, each species with its own signature phrase. Water cascading over stones in the cloister fountain didn't just babble, it pulsed with predictable cadences like a liquid metronome. To these observant minds, the natural world wasn't chaotic. It was a grand composition, written in what we'd now recognize as algorithms. Take Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess who documented the medicinal properties of plants with astonishing precision. Her descriptions of growth cycles, how certain buds unfurled at exact lunar phases or roots thickened in Fibonacci-like spirals, read like early field notes in computational biology. She saw herbs not just as healing tools but as expressions of a deeper mathematical order. When she wrote that the earth is at the center of the universe because it carries the rhythm of creation, she wasn't speaking poetically. She was describing what scientists today call emergent patterns, the way simple rules repeated over time give rise to complex systems. This monastic fascination with natural order reached its zenith in the Bothius illustrated manuscripts where animals became allegories for divine logic. The migratory routes of geese, sketched in meticulous detail, weren't just travelogues, they were proof of an invisible guidance system. Bees constructing hexagonal hives demonstrated geometric perfection, their wax cells echoing the angles of cathedral vaults. Even the erratic flight of moths circling candle flames was passed for hidden rules, long before chaos theory gave us the language of attractors and bifurcations. What's extraordinary is how these observations transcended metaphor. When Cistercian monks designed their water mills, they didn't just harness the river's power, they studied its behavior. Manuscripts from Clairvaux Abbey show monks calculating flow rates and sediment patterns, adjusting wheel angles to optimize efficiency. Their mills became analog computers of sorts, processing nature's algorithms into mechanical action. Similarly, their celestial charts, tracking planetary movements with painstaking accuracy, weren't just for fixing feast dates. They were early attempts to reverse engineer the cosmos's source code, treating the stars as data points in God's grand loop. This legacy resonates in surprising places. Modern researchers studying bird song syntax have found that some species organize their calls using recursive structures, the same nesting of phrases technique medieval composers used in chant. Fluid dynamics now confirms what those monks sensed at their fountains. Turbulence follows mathematical laws, with eddies repeating at scales both vast and microscopic. Even the fractal branching of trees, a buzzword of 1980s chaos theory, finds precedent in the marginalia of illuminated psalters, where monks doodled vine tendrils with uncanny self-similarity. The monks couldn't have imagined machine learning or quantum computing, but their insistence on finding logic in the wild world laid the groundwork for these very fields. When they sketched a flower's petals or charted the moon's phases, they were doing more than pious observation. They were asserting that nature's beauty wasn't random, it was rule-bound, a symphony of algorithms waiting to be decoded. Today, as scientists use AI to predict protein folds or map neural networks, they're walking a path first cleared by robed scholars who believed even a sparrow's flight could be scripture, if only one learned to read it. The fire that consumed the Library of Alexandria wasn't the only blaze to erase humanity's collective memory. Across medieval Europe, countless manuscripts, some of them painstakingly copied by monks over years, vanished into ash, victims of war, accident, or even deliberate destruction. What secrets did those lost pages hold? Among the liturgical chants and biblical commentaries, might there have been treatises on mathematics far beyond what we credit to the medieval mind? The gaps in history aren't just empty spaces, they're invitations to wonder. Consider the fate of the Abbey of Monte Cassino, sacked by Lombards in the 6th century, then rebuilt, only to be leveled again centuries later. Each time libraries burned, yet surviving fragments hint at what might have been lost. A scrap of vellum showing geometric diagrams alongside musical notation, or marginal notes referencing the harmony of numbers in ways that don't align with any known surviving text. Were these just idle doodles or clues to a deeper understanding? The monks who lived through these disasters often wrote of salvaging what they could, but how much slipped through their hands? Then there are the manuscripts we know existed but can't find. Alcuin of York, Charlemagne's chief scholar, mentioned a work called De Musica Mathematica in his letters, a text that supposedly explored the divine proportions hidden in chant. No copy survives. Did it contain breakthroughs we've since rediscovered centuries later, like the golden ratio's role in acoustics, or perhaps methods for calculating intervals that predated Pythagoras by generations? The Benedictine monk Hermanus Contractus, an 11th century polymath, was said to have devised a mechanical astrolabe that could predict celestial events with startling accuracy. His original designs are gone, leaving us to guess whether they contained computational principles lost until the Renaissance. Even more tantalizing are the gaps in the record that suggest deliberate suppression. When the Council of Trent in the 16th century standardized Catholic liturgy, entire volumes of non-conforming chants were purged. Some scholars argue these discarded melodies used unconventional scales or rhythms, mathematically complex structures that didn't fit the Church's simplified vision. Were these innovations too radical, too close to revealing that music's magic was just math in disguise? A handful of surviving heretical texts, like the Cathar scrolls found in Pyrenees caves, contain cryptic references to the numbered song, a concept never fully explained. The greatest loss might be the unwritten knowledge, the oral traditions that never made it to parchment. Monastic reformer Bernard of Clairvaux spoke of a science of tones passed down secretly among Cistercian choirmasters, a method for composing chants that aligned with lunar cycles and architectural acoustics. Without a single written example, we're left piecing together hints from cathedral layouts and chant manuscripts with unusual marginalia. Did this tradition encode acoustic algorithms that allowed certain chants to resonate perfectly in specific spaces, like an early form of algorithmic reverb? What's haunting is how these missing links mirror modern data loss. A corrupted hard drive today isn't so different from a waterlogged codex. Both can erase breakthroughs in an instant. Yet even in absence, there are clues. The precision of surviving medieval instruments, like the organ at Winchester with its 400 pipes tuned to exacting ratios, suggests a sophistication beyond what's documented. The way certain chants, when analyzed with modern software, reveal fractal-like repetition patterns that couldn't have been accidental. These aren't just artifacts, they're breadcrumbs leading to a deeper story. The question isn't just what was lost, but what might still be found. In 2014, a palimpsest in an Austrian monastery revealed erased undertext. A 9th century music theory treatise with notations unlike any known system. New imaging techniques are uncovering similar ghost texts across Europe's libraries. Each one is a potential Rosetta Stone, waiting to crack open a forgotten chapter in the story of how melody became math. Until then, the silence of those lost manuscripts speaks volumes, not just about what we don't know, but about how much more those monks might have understood than we ever imagined. By the mid-20th century, A new kind of monastery emerged, windowless rooms humming with the clicks and whirs of towering machines. Men like Alan Turing, hunched over rows of switches and punch cards, were the unexpected heirs to the medieval monk's legacy. Though separated by centuries, these pioneers shared a startling insight. That computation wasn't just calculation, it was composition. Turing himself compared programming to writing music, where the machine's operations became notes in a grand mechanical symphony. The difference: instead of parchment and quills, they used paper tape and binary. Instead of training voices, they orchestrated electrons. The parallels run deeper than metaphor. Early programmers literally called their instructions playback routines, treating the computer like an instrument waiting for its score. Take the ENIAC, that room-sized behemoth of the 1940s. Programming it involved physically rewiring connections, a process closer to tuning a pipe organ than typing on a keyboard. The engineers even spoke of harmonizing the machine's different units to prevent timing errors, as if debugging were a form of musical counterpoint. And when Grace Hopper invented the first compiler in 1952, she named it a zero, a playful nod to musical notation's lowest pitch, hinting that software might someday scale the same expressive heights as a Bach fugue. What Turing and his peers recognized was the monk's oldest secret, that complex systems thrive on layers of abstraction. Just as medieval notation turned fluid melodies into fixed symbols, programming languages transformed human logic into machine executable steps. The staff lines Guido drew became the registers of a CPU. The neumes rise and fall mapped neatly to binaries, ones and zeros. Even the concept of looping, so central to chant structure, reappeared as the go-to statement, letting programs repeat sequences with monastic precision. The real breakthrough came when programmers stopped seeing code as mere instructions and started treating it as a creative medium. In 1961, Bell Labs engineer Max Matthews wrote Music, the first program to generate digital audio. Suddenly, computers weren't just processing numbers, they were singing. The same mathematical ratios that governed Gregorian chant now shaped synthetic tones, proving that harmony transcended its acoustic origins. Later pioneers like Brian Eno would take this further, using algorithms to compose ambient music where chant's operations mirrored the medieval fascination with procedural beauty. Today, the connection is everywhere if you know where to listen. Modern audio software still uses tracks and sessions, terms borrowed from recording studios but rooted in the linear sequencing of chant notation. AI-generated music builds on neural networks that, in essence, learn from vast datasets like a novice monk memorizing antiphonaries. Even error correction protocols in streaming services descend from the monk's meticulous copying practices, ensuring that a song arrives intact whether played in Tokyo or Toledo. The most poetic twist: somewhere in Silicon Valley, a developer might debug code while listening to a Spotify playlist algorithmically curated to their tastes, unknowingly enjoying the latest iteration of an idea born when inked neumes first met parchment. The monk sought to capture the divine in song. Today's programmers distill human creativity into ones and zeros, different tools, same timeless pursuit, finding the music hidden in the machine. The same mathematical patterns that guided medieval monks now hum inside the servers of Silicon Valley, where artificial intelligence breathes new life into ancient traditions. Today, researchers feed thousands of Gregorian chant transcriptions into neural networks, every neume, every interval, every cadence painstakingly digitized, until the machine begins to recognize the hidden grammar of sacred melody. The results are eerie: algorithms composing original chants that sound as though they were lifted from a forgotten 12th century manuscript, complete with soaring melismas and solemn modal progressions. One such project, Deep Plainchant, generates melodies indistinguishable to most listeners from those penned by Benedictine monks 800 years ago. What makes these digital compositions so unsettlingly authentic isn't just their adherence to medieval scales or rhythms, it's how they mirror the monk's own creative process. Like a novice scribe internalizing the rules of notation, the AI learns through repetition, absorbing patterns from thousands of examples until it can extrapolate new sequences that feel inevitable. When it produces a chant where the Christ-lesson resolves not to the expected tonic but to a hauntingly suspended fourth, it isn't making an error. It's replicating the same calculated deviations medieval composers used to heighten spiritual tension. The machine has, in effect, discovered what the monks knew instinctively, that sacred music thrives on the balance between rule and revelation, yet there's a crucial difference. While medieval composers worked within rigid constraints to honor divine order, AI operates without belief. It mimics the surface of devotion, but lacks the yearning that animated those stone-walled choirs. A neural network might perfectly replicate the interval leaps of a Salve Regina, but can it understand the longing for grace that shaped those phrases? This tension lies at the heart of projects like Cantus Artificialis, where human composers collaborate with AI, curating its outputs to infuse them with liturgical intent. The result is a strange new hybrid, algorithms as tools for devotion, their outputs polished by hands that still tremble with faith. The implications ripple beyond music. Modern AI, like Guido's staff, is fundamentally a notation system, a way to encode complex realities into reproducible symbols. When a monk transcribed a chant, he was creating a set of instructions to recreate an emotional experience across time and space. When a generative model produces a melody, it's executing a far more elaborate version of the same premise. Both are attempts to bottle the ineffable, whether the vessel is vellum or Python code. Perhaps the most poetic outcome is how these AI experiments have deepened our appreciation for medieval innovation. By reverse engineering chant with machine learning, researchers have uncovered subtle compositional tricks, how monks used Fibonacci-like phrase lengths to create subliminal resonance, or embedded numerical symbolism in note counts that corresponded to biblical verses. The algorithms, in their cold precision, have become unlikely allies in decoding the warmth of human ingenuity. As you listen to an AI-generated Agnus Dei shimmering through speakers, consider the circularity of history. The monks who first systematized sound to honor the divine could never have imagined their work would one day train machines. Yet here we are, closing the loop between quill and quantum, between sacred mystery and synthetic voice. The medium has changed, but the central question remains: can the soul of music ever truly be automated, or does it always somehow slip between the notes? Imagine a medieval monk peering over the shoulder of a modern programmer as an AI generates a flawless Gregorian chant. Would he see this as sacrilege, a machine trespassing on sacred creative ground, or as the ultimate fulfillment of his order's quest to systematize divine harmony? This collision of ancient devotion and artificial intelligence forces us to confront questions with no easy answers. Can algorithms truly create art, or are they merely rearranging the echoes of human genius? And if beauty can be reduced to code, what does that mean for the soul behind the song? The monks believed their chants were divinely inspired, channeling celestial harmonies through human voices. Every note was a prayer, every melody an act of worship. Contrast that with how AI composes today, analyzing thousands of existing chants, detecting statistical patterns, and generating new sequences based on probability. The machine has no concept of the sacred, no yearning for transcendence. Yet when researchers at the University of Oxford fed their model centuries of liturgical music, the AI produced a misera so hauntingly authentic that even seasoned choirmasters struggled to distinguish it from a human composer's work. This blurring of boundaries unsettles some theologians who argue that art requires intentionality, a quality algorithms fundamentally lack. Yet history reminds us that innovation has always sparked resistance. When Guido of Arezo introduced the staff in the 11th century, traditionalists accused him of mechanizing spirituality, reducing living prayer to cold symbols on parchment. Sound familiar? Today's debates about AI eerily mirror those medieval fears that by quantifying creativity, we strip it of its humanity. But just as notation didn't diminish music's power, it amplified its reach. Perhaps AI could expand artistic expression in ways we're only beginning to grasp. Projects like Cantus Novus Blend Machine generated melodies with human refinement, creating hybrid works where monks and algorithms collaborate across centuries. The ethical lines grow even sharper when we consider ownership. Medieval chant was communal property, shared freely across monasteries with no concept of copyright. But who owns an AI generated him based on that collective heritage? A recent controversy erupted when a tech startup copyrighted an entire album of algorithmically composed Gregorian chants, sparking outrage among scholars who saw it as the privatization of sacred tradition. This tension exposes a deeper paradox. The very algorithms capable of preserving endangered musical traditions might also commodify them beyond recognition. Perhaps the most profound question isn't whether machines can create art, but what their creations reveal about us. When an AI mimics a 12th century Agnus Dei, it holds up a mirror to human patterns, the hidden structures we intuited but never formally recognized. Like uncovering the Fibonacci sequence in a sunflower, these digital experiments expose the mathematical bones beneath artistic intuition. The monks might have shuddered at silicon choirs, but they'd likely recognize the impulse driving them, the eternal human quest to pass the ineffable, whether through quill, choir, or code. In the shadowy vaults where medieval scribes once labored, servers now hum with synthetic vespers. The medium has changed, but the central mystery remains. Can the sacred ever truly be automated? Or does grace always slip through the cracks of calculation? The answer may lie not in choosing between tradition and innovation, but in hearing the ancient echo that binds them, that every system, no matter how precise, ultimately points beyond itself to something no algorithm can contain. Let's roll up our sleeves and step into the sandals of a medieval monk, because the best way to understand their algorithmic thinking isn't just to hear about it, but to do it. Grab a scrap of paper or open a blank document. We're about to transpose a chant using Guido of Arezo's rules, and you'll see how eerily similar this process is to writing a simple line of code. Start with a basic Gregorian melody like the Ut Quint Laxus hymn Guido himself used. On your page, draw 4 horizontal lines, that's your staff. Now, place the first note on the bottom line and label it Ut, what we'd now call Do. This is your variable declaration, like setting x equals 1 in programming. The next note rises to the space above, that's Re. Follow the contour of the hymn's opening phrase, up to my, down to far, then back up. Each step is an instruction, just like a line of code telling a program to increment or decrement a value. Here's where the logic kicks in. To transpose this chant to a higher pitch, say, moving from what we'd now call C to F, you don't just guess. Guido's system relies on intervals, the measurable distances between notes. A perfect fourth jump like C to F means every note in your melody must shift up by that exact ratio. It's not unlike updating a spreadsheet formula. If you change the input cell, every linked cell updates proportionally. On your staff, you're not copying notes, you're applying a rule. If original note is X, then transposed note is X plus 4 steps. Notice the parallels. Like a programmer debugging a script, medieval scribes had to check their work for errors. A misplaced neume could turn a sacred hymn into dissonance. If your transposed chant suddenly includes a forbidden tritone, the dissonant diabolus in musica, you've introduced a bug, one that would have sent a choirmaster reaching for his eraser. The fix: follow Guido's modal rules, which functioned like error-handling protocols. If interval violates mode, then adjust to nearest permitted note. What feels revelatory is how modular this system is. Just as modern coders reuse functions, monks recycled melodic phrases, that crisp lesson cadence you transposed. It appears in dozens of chants, always following the same interval logic, a medieval version of cutting and pasting a code snippet. Even the act of writing neumes had conventions akin to syntax. A dot meant a slight pause, a semicolon in musical grammar, while a vertical line grouped notes into a single syllable like parentheses nesting operations. As you put down your pen, the realization hits: you weren't just notating music, you were executing an algorithm, a finite set of rules to transform input original chant into output transposed chant with predictable precision. The parchment was your compiler, the neumes your commands, and your brain the processor. And just like debugging a program, the satisfaction comes when your transposed melody works, when the abstract rules produce something that sings. This exercise isn't just historical reenactment, it's a bridge. The same mental muscles you flex today, breaking problems into steps, applying transformations, adhering to syntax, are the ones that power everything from auto-tuned pop songs to AI-generated symphonies. The monks may have been aiming for heavenly harmony, but in teaching us to think this way, they quietly composed the future. The echoes of those medieval chant books resonate far beyond monastery walls. They pulse through every algorithm that shapes our digital lives today. What began as a way to standardize sacred song has become the invisible architecture of modern existence, proving that the most profound innovations often emerge where disciplines collide. Those monks hunched over parchment by candlelight weren't just preserving hymns, they were accidentally drafting a blueprint for the future, one where art and logic dance in perpetual partnership. Consider the humble playlist on your favorite streaming service. When it suggests a song that feels uncannily right, it's leveraging the same principles of pattern recognition that guided medieval composers. The algorithm analyzes sequences, how often certain chords follow others, which rhythms recur, just as monks noted how certain melodic phrases evoked deeper devotion. Even Spotify's shuffle function owes a debt to the monk's modular approach, where interchangeable chant phrases could be rearranged like liturgical building blocks. The tech feels cutting edge, but the underlying idea that creativity thrives within structured systems is centuries old. This history also reframes how we think about interdisciplinary breakthroughs. We tend to silo art and science as opposing forces, but the monks reveal their essential kinship. Guido of Arezo didn't invent musical notation because he was a brilliant musician. He did it because he thought like a mathematician, recognizing that sound could be mapped spatially. Similarly, Ada Lovelace's pioneering work on computer programming drew directly on her training in music theory, where she saw algorithms in the interplay of notes. Today's most transformative technologies, from AI-generated art to quantum computing's harmonic oscillations, continue this tradition, proving that the richest discoveries bloom at the intersection of intuition and logic. There's a deeper lesson here about where innovation truly begins. We often imagine breakthroughs springing from well-funded labs or tech giants, but the monks remind us that necessity, not resources, is the mother of invention. Faced with the urgent problem of preserving oral traditions across generations, they developed a system so robust it outlasted empires. Their tools were quills and parchment, ours are silicon and code. But the impulse remains identical: to solve pressing human problems through elegant, reproducible systems. When a modern developer writes a sorting algorithm or designs a user interface, they're walking the same path as those medieval scribes, just with faster feedback loops. Perhaps most importantly, this lineage challenges the myth of the lone genius. Gregorian chant wasn't composed by a single brilliant mind, but refined collaboratively over centuries, with each monastery contributing variations that slowly distilled into universal rules. Open-source software development follows strikingly similar rhythms. Think of Linux or Wikipedia, where incremental contributions from countless individuals coalesce into something greater than any one creator could achieve. The monk's legacy isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a timeless model for how knowledge grows when shared freely and built upon collectively. As we stand on the brink of AI-driven creativity, these roots offer both inspiration and caution. The same notation system that preserved sacred music also made it possible to mass-produce disposable pop tunes. Algorithms can amplify human artistry or flatten it into predictable formulas. The difference lies in how we wield these tools, as the monks did, with a reverence for the mystery that lingers beyond the edges of any system. Their greatest gift wasn't the staff or the neumes, but the wisdom to know that even the most perfect rules are just vessels, containers for the ineffable spark that no notation can fully capture. So the next time you hum along to a perfectly curated playlist or marvel at a chatbot's lyrical output, listen closely. Beneath the digital sheen, you'll hear the faintest echo of chanting voices, a reminder that every leap forward is built on layers of ingenuity stretching back further than we often pause to remember. The monks may have sought the divine, but in their pursuit, they gave us something equally miraculous: proof that humanity's oldest arts and newest technologies are, at heart, variations on the same eternal theme. From the quiet scriptoria of medieval monasteries to the hum of data centers, the monks' musical algorithms quietly shaped our world. Think about that the next time your streaming service suggests a song that feels eerily perfect, because those recommendations trace their lineage back to scribes etching neumes onto parchment. The same principles that let a 10th century monk in Cluny reproduce a chant with flawless accuracy now power the algorithms curating your playlist, proving that innovation isn't always about inventing something new. Sometimes it's about recognizing the hidden potential in tools we've been using all along. This story upends the way we imagine progress. We picture technological leaps as sudden ruptures, the lightning bolt of inspiration, the lone genius in a garage, but history whispers a different truth. The digital revolution didn't begin with silicon chips or Turing machines. It began with a problem any monk could understand: how to preserve something as fleeting as a melody across time and space. Their solution, breaking sound into symbols, then rules, then systems, wasn't just notation. It was the first draft of a world where everything could be encoded, transmitted, and reconstructed. What's humbling is how much the monks didn't know they were building. When Guido of Arezo drew those 4 lines, he wasn't dreaming of computers. He just wanted choirs to sing in tune. Yet in standardizing pitch, he accidentally standardized thought, creating a framework where abstract concepts could be manipulated as precisely as physical objects. Today, when a programmer writes a loop or a musician quantizes a drumbeat, they're speaking Guido's language. The medium has changed, but the grammar remains. This legacy challenges us to look differently at our own tools. The apps and algorithms we take for granted might contain seeds of futures we can't yet imagine. Maybe the blockchain is this century's neume notation, a seemingly niche system that could one day underpin something far grander. Or perhaps the AI art generators sparking debate today are like the first mechanical automata, crude now, but the start of a trajectory we'll only understand in hindsight. As the screen fades and the video ends, don't just hit subscribe, take a moment to listen. To the rhythm of your keyboard clicks, the pulse of your notifications, even the syncopated beat of a passing car's bass line. Beneath the noise of the modern world, the monk's quiet logic still hums, reminding us that the past isn't just prologue. It's the foundation, the blueprint, the first iteration of systems we're still refining. And who knows, 1,000 years from now, someone might trace their futuristic marvels back to the tools we're building today. After all, the most transformative ideas rarely announce themselves as revolutions. They start as solutions to small, sacred problems like how to keep a melody alive.